President Trump says the U.S. will, quote, always be there for NATO, but doubts the alliance would come to Washington's aid in times of need. His comments come as tensions within the alliance rise over the White House's push to acquire Greenland through a range of options that could include military action.
All options are always on the table for President Trump as he examines what's in the best interests of the United States. But I will just say that the president's first option always has been diplomacy.
The U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio expected to meet Danish and Greenland officials at their request next week to discuss the Arctic territory. The Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen earlier said a U.S. takeover of Greenland would mean the end of NATO. Its European allies have rallied behind Denmark and the Arctic territory, rejecting Washington's threats.
Es ist vollkommen klar, über das Schicksal Grönlands entscheiden die Grönländerinnen und Grönländer und das Königreich Dänemark, zu dessen Hoheitsgebiet Grönland gehört.
Ces intimidations doivent cesser et le Danemark sait pouvoir compter avec la solidarité des pays européens qui l'ont rappelé par la voix de leur chef d'État et de gouvernement dans un communiqué commun pas plus tard qu'hier.
President Trump's threats to take over Greenland are posing an unprecedented challenge to NATO. The idea that one NATO country could attack another is so foreign that scenario is not even mentioned in the alliance's founding treaty. There's no provision for expelling a country, though members are committed to, quote, live in peace with all peoples and all governments. The Denmark's prime minister has warned that if the U.S. chooses to attack, that would spell the end of the defense alliance that Europe has relied on for its security since the end of World War II. The U.S. is NATO's biggest and most powerful member. And analysts say it would not function without America's leadership and firepower. That Greenland doesn't have its own military and is part of NATO through Denmark. If you look at the numbers, the U.S. has 1.3 million active military personnel, but Denmark has just 13,100. President Trump has said that he wants to increase defense spending to $1.5 trillion in 2027. NATO figures show Washington was expected to spend $845 billion on defense last year, but the combined spending of the 31 other members stands at just $559 billion. The ease at which the U.S. was able to strike Venezuela and capture Maduro has provoked alarm across the globe. The question now is, would any NATO members defend Greenland if the U.S. sought to take it? Would they be able to?
For more on this story, let's speak to Andrew Hyde, his senior fellow at the Stimson Center. Andrew, thank you very much for joining us during these confusing times. And frankly, I'm confused why a U.S. takeover. Thank you, Andrew. So I'm confused. Why is a U.S. takeover, either militarily or by force sale of Greenland, even on the table? It was Washington, we know, which chose to draw down its forces in the Arctic, and there is a treaty in place that allows the U.S. almost a free hand, gives it a free hand to boost levels again. So from one base, it could be 10, it could be 100, it could be 1,000.
Well, this is what I think a lot of people in Washington are struggling to understand. In some respects, President Trump's interests in Greenland stretches back into his first administration, so it shouldn't be of any surprise. And yet it is, because for the reasons you mentioned, the U.S. has had a free hand in Greenland and has had a very good relationship up till now with Denmark, and has been able, one would think, to do what it really needs to do or wants to do in Greenland. So that is, I think, a real question as to why. Now, I think if you look at Venezuela and you look at sort of some of the general statements of the Trump administration, and particularly the national security strategy, you see a desire to really have the U.S. dominant in the Western Hemisphere. And I think that means the U.S. really being in charge and not necessarily relying on cooperation with a country from outside of the hemisphere in this case. That would be one line of explanation, I think. But again, as you say, the U.S. really has freedom of action, I think, in the key areas.
So, Andrew, when it comes to the threat of U.S. military action against Greenland, just how real is it? And if force isn't the first choice, what's the most realistic path that Mr. Trump would take instead?
Well, again, very much in contrast, I think, to Venezuela and others. I mean, it wouldn't take much U.S. military action for the reasons you mentioned, and I know Denmark doesn't have really military forces in a traditional sense stationed there in any way. So, the U.S. base there has 200 troops or personnel. It wouldn't be hard to augment that enough. I don't think that anyone in Greenland would put up a fight. So I would think it would be relatively bloodless in that respect, if you want to speculate as to what that would look like. In fact, I could almost imagine you're more busy sending bureaucrats and officials there than you are actually sending military, because I just don't think there would be a resistance or there would be any combat.
Andrew, from a legal perspective, if you like, the Deputy White House Chief of Staff, Stephen Miller, has put forward that, the U.S. national interest, is at stake here, saying that, Denmark's claim and Greenland's sovereignty really are the most important issues here. And we also know, by the way, that the U.S. has tried to buy Greenland at least 3 times historically. So does any of this actually amount to a legitimate U.S. claim on the island, strictly from a legal perspective?
No, I mean, that's the short answer. I can't come up with anything that justifies it. You're right. The U.S. has expressed interest before. Denmark has rebuffed it. The United States, interestingly enough, I was just doing some research on this, did of course buy several islands in the Caribbean from Greenland back in the early part of the 20th century. And that was done by a purchase agreement using gold, and then followed by a treaty, which required congressional approval. None of that seems to be on the table in this case. And obviously, both Denmark and Greenland and the Greenland government have said they're not interested in selling at this stage.
Andrew, I think you mentioned this very briefly moments ago, but I want to press you a little bit about this link. Is there one between Greenland, the capture of Nicolas Maduro, and the latest seizure of 2 shadow tankers linked to Venezuelan oil? I mean, is it purely coincidental or reflective of where the Trump administration is taking its foreign policy?
Yeah, I think I would say there's kind of an emotional link, in a sense that obviously after the Venezuela operation, there's a lot of feeling in the White House, apparently, and the administration that this worked out very well. And that has clearly emboldened them. I mean, you see the president's comments really, hours after the Venezuela takeover to say, or the Venezuela kidnapping, if you want to call it that. You see the president's comments to say we are really interested now in Greenland. And so I think there's a kind of wind in the sails, if you will. But the situations obviously are quite different. And what the U.S. is doing with Venezuela, for example, is leaving the current government in place, really saying, well, the U.S. is going to run things, but doing it at arm's length. The rhetoric around Greenland is very much that this would become part of the U.S. and the U.S. would take it over directly. So in that sense, I think there's a very big difference.
Okay, and Andrew, let's talk about Europe's response. Now, the allies saying they're working on a plan if the U.S. moves on Greenland. But what tools do they have? Would their pressure actually change Trump's calculations, or do you think it would risk hardening his position instead?
I would say they really risk hardening. I think the options are pretty limited unless it gets very extreme. Clearly, this presents a real existential crisis to NATO, and so the cost there would be quite high. I think so far we've seen the European Union has been fairly unified in its support of Denmark and rebuffing this idea, not in a very aggressive way, but just saying this is unacceptable and we would not tolerate it. What would they have as an option? Well, I think they obviously could affect trade with the U.S., but that would hurt Europe more than I think it would hurt the U.S. And it would be more costly to Europe. There would be other things they could consider. You could consider sanctions and other kinds of things that Europe would place on the U.S. Again, that's kind of a little mind-blowing to think, what would that actually look like, and what would that involve? Clearly, I think that the Trump administration has sort of priced some of that into their rhetoric at this stage. Although what I really feel they're doing is kind of testing the waters and really understanding, well, what might the reaction be, and analyzing that as they think of a way forward. Okay,
Andrew, so to your point about, the limited options and what you just outlined in terms of the implications for NATO. We know that the alliance chief, Mark Rutte, has tried charm, he's tried flattery on Trump. Sometimes that's worked, sometimes it hasn't. I'm wondering if you think it's time for him, as the alliance chief, to be a bit more assertive and to, I suppose, to reach out more and say, look, this is what's at stake. You should really reconsider the public statements that, he's been making and also the White House officials have been making.
I think that I really honestly believe that is happening behind the scenes. I don't think that would be very productive for Mr. Rutte or NATO to do that publicly. So I'm not surprised that hasn't happened, but I would be very surprised if there haven't been a lot of back-channel conversations, both with the White House and senior levels of the State Department, to emphasize how serious this is being taken and what the threat would be to NATO as a result.
Andrew, thank you very much. Great talking to you on the show this morning. We were speaking to Andrew Hyde, who's Senior Fellow at the Stimson Center.